My name is Thomas Caldwell, 70 years old, and a retired civil engineer who spent his life building foundations to weather any storm. But nothing prepared me for the sudden collapse of my own flesh and blood. My only son slapped me 13 times right in our living room while his wife watched and laughed. So I sold his multi-million-dollar house right out from under him while he was sitting at his corporate desk. Before I dive into exactly how I dismantled his entire life, please let me know what city or country you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to make a heartbreaking choice to stand up to family members who completely underestimated your worth. It was a cold, gray Tuesday morning in our upscale Seattle suburb. The rain was beating relentlessly against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the living room. It was a beautiful room filled with imported Italian leather furniture, modern art, and a pristine white marble fireplace. I knew exactly how much every single piece of it cost because my life savings had paid for the very walls that surrounded us. But at that moment, the luxury of the house felt like a prison cell. I was sitting on the edge of a velvet armchair, my shoulders hunched, staring down at my worn slippers. Standing directly over me was Brad, my 42-year-old son. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored navy suit, adjusting his expensive silk tie. He looked like the perfect, successful corporate sales director, but the look in his eyes was something I did not recognize. It was pure, unadulterated contempt. Without warning, his hand shot out. He struck my cheek. It was not a punch. It was a sharp, stinging, open-handed slap across the face. The sound echoed in the cavernous living room. I gasped, raising my trembling hands to shield my face, but he just knocked them away and struck me again. 1,000, Brad said, his voice eerily calm and calculated. He slapped me a third time. My skin burned, and a deep, sickening knot twisted in my stomach. 2,000, he counted, striking me again. 3,000. He was not trying to leave bruises. He was not trying to knock me unconscious. He was doing something much worse. He was degrading me. He was stripping away every ounce of my dignity, establishing absolute dominance over a man he believed was too old, too weak, and too senile to do anything about it. 4,000, he hissed, delivering another stinging blow. 5,000. I risked a glance across the room. Monica, my 38-year-old daughter-in-law, was lounging on the plush sofa. At 8 in the morning, she was already sipping an expensive Pinot Noir from a crystal glass, completely unfazed by the fact that her husband was assaulting his elderly father. She was dressed in designer loungewear, her hair perfectly styled for another day of doing absolutely nothing but spending money. When our eyes met, she did not look away in shame. Instead, she let out a soft, amused laugh, taking another sip of her wine, as if she were watching a mildly entertaining television show. 6,000. Brad counted, his hand connecting with my jaw again. 7,000. My vision blurred with unshed tears. Not tears of physical pain, though my face was throbbing fiercely. They were tears of profound, soul-crushing heartbreak. This was the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. The boy whose college tuition I had worked overtime for years to pay. The boy whose mother my beautiful Martha had cherished until the day she died just 8 months ago. If Martha could see him now, it would have killed her all over again. 8,000, 9,000, 10,000. I slumped forward deliberately, shaking my shoulders, making myself look even smaller, even more pathetic. I let out a weak, raspy sob, begging him to stop. "Please, Brad," I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly. "Please, son, I do not have it." 11,000, he said, his breathing barely elevated. 12,000, 13,000. He stopped. He wiped his hand on his pristine suit trousers, as if touching my skin had soiled his hands. He leaned down, his face inches from mine. I could smell his expensive cologne, a scent that now made me feel physically sick. $13,000, old man, Brad sneered, pointing a finger directly at my chest. That is exactly what you owe us for this month. You think living in this neighborhood is free. You think the medical care and the food we provide you comes out of thin air. I know you have exactly $13,000 left in your private pension account. I checked the mail. I saw the statement. But Brad, I stammered, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. That is all I have left for my medications. That is my emergency fund. Monica scoffed from the couch, setting her wineglass down on the marble coffee table. Your emergency is that you are living under our roof, taking up space, she said, her voice dripping with venom. You do not need an emergency fund. You need to pay your rent. You are lucky we even let you stay in the guest room. We could have put you in a state facility months ago. Brad snapped his fingers to get my attention back on him. You are going to go to the bank today. You are going to withdraw a cashier's check for $13,000, and you are going to hand it to Monica by 2 o'clock this afternoon so she can deposit it. If you do not have that money waiting for us when we get back from work, I will personally pack your bags and leave you at a homeless shelter downtown. Do you understand me? I forced my hands to shake violently. I nodded slowly, a tear slipping down my red cheek. Yes. Yes, Brad. I understand. I will go to the bank. Good, Brad said, adjusting his cuffs. See? It is not that hard to contribute to the family. He grabbed his leather briefcase from the entryway. Monica stood up, smoothing her clothes, and slipped on a trench coat that cost more than my first car. She walked past me without a second glance, linking her arm through Brad's. Do not forget, Thomas. Monica called out over her shoulder, her tone mocking and sweet. 2 o'clock. Do not make us be the bad guys. They walked out the front door. The heavy oak slammed shut behind them. I heard the electronic lock engage. A few seconds later, the low rumble of their new BMW echoed from the garage, followed by the sound of tires rolling down the wet driveway and fading into the distance. I sat there, in the silent, empty mansion, for a full minute, listening to the rain tap against the glass. The house was completely still. Every instinct I had as a man, as a father, had screamed at me to stand up and strike him back. I had spent 40 years on construction sites. I was old, but I was not weak. I could have broken his jaw. But an engineer knows that striking blindly only damages the surface. To truly bring down a corrupt structure, you have to target the foundation. I took a deep breath. My violently shaking hands stopped instantly. My hunched shoulders straightened. The pathetic, terrified expression on my face vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating calm. I reached up and wiped the lone tear from my cheek, feeling the lingering sting of the 13 slaps. I stood up from the armchair. My knees did not wobble. My back did not ache. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and watched the rain wash over the pristine neighborhood. My reflection stared back at me in the glass. I did not see a broken, helpless 70-year-old man. I saw a man who spent his life analyzing structural weaknesses. I had played the part of the senile, frightened victim perfectly. I needed them to feel powerful. I needed them to believe they had absolute control over me, that I was just a clueless burden waiting for their permission to breathe. Arrogance creates blind spots, and Brad and Monica were completely blinded by their own greed. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I did not open my banking app to check my pension. Instead, I opened my contacts and stared at a number I had saved weeks ago, waiting for the precise moment to strike. They think this is their house, I whispered to the empty room, my voice steady and firm. They think they hold all the cards. They do not know those 13 slaps just signed the death warrant on their entire life. I turned away from the window, rolling my shoulders back. I had a busy morning ahead of me and a lot of calls to make. Because while my son was sitting at his comfortable corporate desk, dreaming about his stolen money, I was about to sell the ground right out from under his feet. To understand how a father and son end up in a living room, fighting over dignity and money, you have to go back to a time when there was actual love between us, or at least the illusion of it. 8 short months ago, my world did not consist of 13 slaps or threats of being thrown onto the street. My world was Martha. We had been married for 42 years. When she died of a sudden heart attack, a massive void swallowed my entire existence. I was left alone in a colonial house that echoed with her absence. Everywhere I looked, I saw the ghost of the woman I loved. The silence was deafening. I was vulnerable, exhausted, and drowning in a deep, suffocating grief that clouded my judgment completely. That is exactly when Brad stepped in. In the weeks following the funeral, Brad was the picture of a devoted son. He and Monica drove down every weekend, bringing hot meals and sitting with me on the porch for hours. Brad would hold my hand, his eyes shining with tears that I now realize were fabricated. He played the role of the grieving child to absolute perfection. He looked around my empty house and told me how worried he was about me living alone. He said the stairs were too steep, the maintenance too demanding, and the isolation bad for my heart. He painted a flawless picture of a tight-knit family. He said I belonged with them, surrounded by warmth and care rather than fading away in a house full of painful memories. Then came the pitch. It happened on a rainy Sunday evening. We were sitting at my dining table drinking coffee. Brad leaned across the table, placing his hand over mine, looking at me with pure concern. He told me they had found a beautiful property in an exclusive neighborhood in Seattle. It was a sprawling mansion with a ground-floor suite, perfect for me. "We want you with us, Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But we need your help. If you sell this place, we can pool our resources. We can buy the Seattle house together in the family name. You will never have to worry about a mortgage payment or a lonely evening ever again." I hesitated. Selling meant letting go of the last physical piece of Martha. Brad saw my hesitation and doubled down. "Dad, you are grieving," he said softly. "The last thing you need is the stress of real estate agents, tax forms, and heavy lifting. Let me handle the paperwork. Let me take the burden off your shoulders. You just focus on healing. I will manage the transaction and the lawyers. Trust me, I am your son. I will protect you." I looked into his eyes and saw the boy I had raised. I believed him. I trusted my flesh and blood with my life. I gave him my blessing. Within a month, I had sold the home Martha and I built. I liquidated my entire life savings, exactly $800,000 in hard cash. Per Brad's instructions, I wired every penny into a joint account he had supposedly set up. He assured me my name was on the deed, safely nested alongside his. He handled all the closing documents, bringing me stacks of signature pages, flagged with sticky notes, telling me to just sign on the dotted lines because reading the legal jargon would only give me a headache. I was a very vulnerable 70-year-old man, deeply mourning my beloved wife, and desperately eager for the quiet peace he had promised. I blindly signed everything he put in front of me without asking a single question. I handed over my financial independence with a foolish, grateful smile, unaware of the dark, looming disaster. When we moved into the Seattle mansion, things seemed perfect for the first few weeks. The house was magnificent. My suite was comfortable. The neighborhood was pristine, and Monica cooked dinner for us every night. I felt a profound sense of relief. I believed I had made the smartest decision of my twilight years. I thought I was securing a safe, loving environment for my final chapter. I spent my days reading in the garden, chatting with the neighbors, and quietly missing my wife but finding comfort in the presence of my son. I was completely oblivious to the trap that had already snapped shut around my ankles. They went out of their way to make me feel welcome. Brad bought me a custom recliner. Monica planted my favorite rose bushes. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. I was living in a beautifully decorated cage financed entirely by my own gullibility. The memory of those early days makes my stomach churn now. Sitting here in this empty, quiet house, looking at the rain sliding down the pristine glass, knowing what I know today, every word of comfort Brad offered feels like venom. It sickens me to realize how easily I was played. I was grieving and they saw a walking bank account. The warmth was a calculated investment. The concern was a strategic maneuver to access my bank accounts. Every hug, every shared cup of coffee, every reassurance was simply a stepping stone to his ultimate goal of draining my resources. I close my eyes, and I can still hear the gentle, caring tone of his voice as he promised to protect me. The contrast between that voice and the cold, cruel counting of his slaps this morning is enough to drive a man to madness. But the illusion of the happy family did not last long. A predator can only wear a mask of kindness for so long before their true nature begins to bleed through. The shift was not immediate. It did not happen overnight. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of my independence. It started with small, dismissive comments about my daily habits. Then came the sudden, strange restrictions on what I could touch or use in the house. The ground floor suite he promised me became just the guest room, a title Monica emphasized at every opportunity. I went from being an honored, respected patriarch to a tolerated, annoying burden in the short span of a few months. I snapped back to reality, the sharp sting on my cheek, a fresh reminder of my profound foolishness. The warm memories sour completely as my mind drifts to the very first moment my gut told me something was terribly wrong. It was not a grand, loud confrontation or a sudden, explosive argument. It was a quiet, deeply insidious discovery that shattered my blind faith forever. It was the exact moment I realized my trusting nature had led me into a truly fatal mistake. A mistake that would force me to tear down my own son to survive. A mistake that began with a simple missing envelope and a very poorly executed, arrogant lie. It started about 4 months after I moved into the Seattle house. The initial honeymoon phase of our living arrangement had evaporated. Warm dinners Monica used to cook were replaced by takeout boxes left on the counter. Brad was working late more often, leaving me to navigate the massive, echoing house alone. As a retired civil engineer, my entire life has been governed by systems, schedules, and precise mathematics. Every Tuesday, I would check my mail, review expenses, and file my receipts. Even though Brad promised to handle the heavy financial lifting, I still liked to know exactly where I stood financially. I liked to see the paper trail of my life, but then the paper trail vanished. It was a subtle absence at first. A missing newsletter here, a delayed bill there. I did not think much of it until the second week of October. That was when my monthly bank statement for the joint account failed to arrive. I had meticulously deposited $800,000 into that account. It was the sum total of the work of my entire life. Naturally, I expected to see the standard fee deductions, but the mailbox remained completely empty. I told myself to be patient, blaming the autumn storms that frequently disrupted service in our area. My patience ran out 3 days later when my phone rang. It was the local pharmacy calling about my diabetes medications. The pharmacist, a kind woman who knew me by name, sounded deeply apologetic. She informed me that my automatic refill could not be processed. The payment card attached to my profile had been declined. I was stunned. I asked her to run it again, assuming there was a clerical error. She ran it, but the result was identical: insufficient funds. My heart skipped a beat. That was mathematically impossible. There should have been a substantial buffer left in that account. A heavy, uncomfortable feeling settled in my chest. It was the same feeling I used to get on a job site when a support beam looked fine to the naked eye, but the structural calculations suggested it was about to crack. I needed answers. I decided to speak with Monica. She handled the daily household administration while Brad was at the office. I found her in the sprawling, marble-covered kitchen. She was wearing a silk robe, tapping away on her tablet while a high-end espresso machine hummed. I politely mentioned that the pharmacy had called. I explained that my card had been declined and asked about my recent statements. Monica did not even look up from her screen at first. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her espresso. Then she let out a soft, theatrical sigh, as if I had just interrupted her with a childish complaint. She finally turned to look at me, pasting on a smile that did not reach her cold eyes. "Oh, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet condescension. The bank had a massive glitch in their system this week. Plus, we moved all the accounts to paperless billing to be eco-friendly. We do not need all that clutter. Do not stress your heart over it. Brad has got it handled. You just focus on relaxing. She patted my arm and turned back to her tablet. I stood there in the middle of the kitchen, feeling a strange mixture of embarrassment and rising alarm. On the surface, her explanation sounded plausible. Paperless billing is the modern standard. But my engineer brain immediately rejected the underlying logic. A technical glitch might delay a statement, but it does not cause a debit card tied to an account with hundreds of thousands of dollars to suddenly bounce for a $40 prescription. Furthermore, moving to paperless billing requires an authorization I had never given. I nodded quietly, played the part of the confused but compliant old man, and shuffled back to my room. The seed of doubt had been planted. I spent the rest of the day pacing my room. I tried to read, but my mind kept circling back to the unblinking smile Monica gave me. It was the smile of someone who was lying. Night fell and the house grew quiet. Brad came home late and retreated to his home office without saying more than 2 words to me. By midnight, they were both fast asleep upstairs. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling. The math was not adding up. I needed a glass of water to calm my nerves. I stepped out of my room and padded softly down the hallway. The kitchen was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the streetlights outside. As I filled my glass from the refrigerator dispenser, my eyes fell on the kitchen trash can. It was overflowing. A heavy-duty black garbage bag had been pulled from the bin and tied tightly at the top, left by the back door, to be taken out to the garage. Monica always insisted the trash be taken out immediately if it contained food scraps, but she had apparently been too lazy to carry it outside herself. I walked over to the bag, intending to simply take it out. I picked up the heavy plastic bag by the knot. As I hoisted it up, the sharp corner of a discarded plastic container snagged the side of the bag, tearing a small gash near the bottom. I carried the torn bag out through the side door and into the dimly lit garage. I placed it inside the large municipal waste bin. As I went to pull my hands away, I noticed something through the tear in the plastic. It was a dense, wet mass of coffee grounds. But mixed into the dark, damp sludge were hundreds of tiny uniform strips of white paper. My breath caught in my throat. My hands moved on their own. I reached into the tear in the garbage bag, pushing aside the wet coffee grounds and damp paper towels. I pulled out a handful of the shredded paper strips. The garage lighting was poor, so I carried the handful of damp shreds back into the kitchen, holding them carefully under the under-cabinet lights. My hands began to tremble. I laid the strips out on the granite countertop. They were completely shredded, clearly run through a heavy-duty cross-cut machine. The person who shredded them made a careless mistake. They dumped wet coffee grounds directly on top of the shreds in a deliberate attempt to ruin the paper, to make it completely unreadable. But the dampness had caused some of the shredded pieces to stick together perfectly. I used my fingernail to separate 2 strips. The distinct dark blue logo of my bank stared back. I separated another. I could clearly read my own name, Thomas Caldwell, printed in the standard block letters of a monthly statement. I found another strip showing a transaction column. The missing mail had not been delayed by a storm or eco-friendly transition. It had been systematically taken from my mailbox, shredded into tiny pieces, and buried under garbage. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was physical reality. The next morning, Brad and Monica moved around the kitchen with the breezy confidence of people who believed they owned the world. Monica was typing furiously on her smartphone, complaining loudly about a delayed shipment of imported Italian tile she had ordered. I sat quietly at the cold kitchen island, forcing myself to slowly eat a bowl of bland oatmeal. My hands were perfectly steady. The shredded pieces of my bank statements were still hidden safely in my bedroom, a silent testament to the criminal deception happening right in front of me. I hunched my shoulders, kept my eyes downcast, and offered a weak smile when Monica casually reminded me to take my heart medication. I waited patiently, counting the seconds, until the heavy oak front door clicked shut and the electronic deadbolt finally engaged. As soon as I heard the low hum of their luxury sedan fade down the wet suburban street, I stood up. The fragile, confused old man vanished instantly. I retrieved my wallet and called a local cab company, deliberately not using a ride-sharing application, to leave no digital footprint. I needed to move like a ghost. 20 minutes later, I slid into the back seat of a worn yellow taxi. The driver asked how my morning was going, and I gave him a polite, empty answer as the rain began to fall against the windows again. I directed him to the main branch of my financial institution in downtown Seattle. The ride took 35 minutes, and with every passing mile, the heavy knot in my stomach tightened. I had spent 40 years calculating structural loads, stress points, and the breaking limits of steel. I knew a collapsing structure when I saw one. The taxi pulled up to the curb outside the towering glass and steel building. I paid the taxi driver in cash, stepped out into the cold drizzle, and walked through the heavy revolving doors. The lobby of the bank was warm, quiet, and smelled faintly of floor wax and expensive cologne. It was a familiar place, a sanctuary where I had safely stored the fruits of my lifelong labor. I walked directly to the reception desk and asked to speak with the branch manager. The young woman behind the counter checked my identification. After a brief moment on her computer, her polite smile faltered. She asked me to take a seat in the waiting area, assuring me that Mr. Davis would be right with me. I sat on a leather sofa, watching the busy professionals hurry past. Sitting there, those 5 minutes truly felt like an absolute eternity. Finally, Mr. Davis emerged from a glass-walled office. He recognized me immediately as a premium client for over 2 decades. He ushered me into his private office, closing the heavy glass door behind us. I took a seat across from his polished wooden desk. I told him straight away that I had not been receiving my monthly statements and my pharmacy card had been declined for insufficient funds. I asked him to pull up my joint account, the one I had opened with my son 8 months ago, the one that held my $800,000 life savings. Mr. Davis nodded sympathetically, apologizing for the inconvenience. He turned to his dual monitors and began typing. I watched his face. I watched as his professional, reassuring smile slowly melted away, replaced by a deep, troubled frown. He stopped typing. He clicked his mouse a few times, leaned closer to the screen, and then slowly looked up at me. The silence in the office was absolute. "Thomas," he began, his voice dropping to a serious, hushed tone. "Did you authorize a series of large wire transfers over the past 6 months?" "No," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "I have not authorized any wire transfers." Mr. Davis removed his glasses with a heavy sigh. "Thomas, the balance in your premium savings account is 0. I was absolutely stunned and speechless. I stopped breathing completely. The words hung in the air, impossible and surreal. 0. $800,000, the result of 40 years of sweat, early mornings, and late nights on dusty construction sites. Simply gone. I asked him to explain exactly where the money went. He turned his monitor slightly so I could see the screen. It was not a single massive theft. It was a calculated, systematic bleeding. Over the span of 6 months, dozens of high-value wire transfers had been executed online, all utilizing the joint access credentials my son possessed. The funds were not transferred into Brad's personal accounts. They had been funneled into a newly registered limited liability company. Mr. Davis highlighted the receiving entity on the screen. It was a business registered solely under the name Monica Caldwell. The stated purpose of the company was listed as wholesale distribution for a luxury cosmetics brand. There was no cosmetics brand. It was a phantom company, an empty corporate shell designed for the sole purpose of laundering my life savings away from my control and dropping it directly into my daughter-in-law's manicured hands. I sat in the plush leather chair, absorbing the devastating magnitude of the theft. I was completely broke on paper. My emergency funds, my medical safety net, my entire financial foundation had been excavated from beneath me while I slept under their roof. The sheer audacity of their crime was breathtaking. They had used my grief over Martha's death as a weapon manipulating me into signing joint access forms under the guise of family protection. They had stolen my money to fund their lavish lifestyle, to buy designer clothes and imported tiles, all while treating me like a burdensome stray dog. Mr. Davis offered to immediately freeze all linked accounts and contact the fraud department. I raised my hand to stop him. "No," I said softly. "Do not flag the account yet. Do not send any alerts to my son. I need a printed copy of every single transaction from the last 8 months, and I need it completely off the record." Mr. Davis hesitated, warning me about the legal implications of wire fraud, but he saw the unyielding determination in my eyes. He printed the documents, placing them into a thick manila envelope. I thanked him, walked out of the quiet bank, and hailed another taxi. The ride back to the suburb was a blur of gray skies and rain. My mind was racing, calculating variables, measuring risk, and drafting a blueprint for absolute destruction. I clutched the heavy, damp manila envelope tightly against my chest. The hardest part was not the betrayal. The hardest part was knowing exactly what I had to do next. I had to go right back to that sprawling mansion. I had to sit down at the expensive dining room table. I had to look at the 2 people who had gleefully robbed me blind, and I had to eat dinner with them. I had to swallow my roaring fury, play the part of the frail, ignorant old fool, and pretend I knew absolutely nothing while secretly preparing to burn their fraudulent empire to the ground. I walked through the heavy front door of the mansion just before 6 o'clock that evening. My clothes were slightly damp from the Seattle rain, but my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. I hung my coat on the brass rack and shuffled my feet against the hardwood floor, deliberately slowing my pace. If Brad and Monica needed me to be a broken, confused old man, I was going to give them the greatest performance of my life. I let my shoulders droop. I allowed a slight tremor to return to my hands. When I entered the kitchen, the aroma of roasted garlic and expensive cuts of beef filled the air. Monica was standing at the massive marble island, unboxing a huge shipment of luxury goods. She barely acknowledged my presence. I walked over to the counter and poured myself a glass of tap water, keeping my head bowed to hide my eyes. My absolute silence was my best camouflage. For the next 3 weeks, I became a total ghost in my own home. I learned to move around without making a single sound. I watched them closely, meticulously, memorizing their daily routines, their schedules, and their careless habits. The sheer audacity of their constant spending was truly staggering to witness. Almost every single day, delivery drivers would drop off large packages wrapped in premium tissue paper and securely sealed with expensive silk ribbons. One afternoon, Monica strutted into the formal living room carrying a brand new designer handbag. It was beautifully crafted from exotic leather, bearing a famous brand name that I knew cost upwards of $5,000. She paraded it proudly in front of the large hallway mirror, admiring her reflection with a look of absolute vanity and deep satisfaction. Yet less than 2 hours later, when I handed her the pharmacy receipt for my monthly insulin supply, her entire demeanor instantly shifted. She aggressively snatched the paper from my trembling hand and rolled her eyes in profound irritation. "Thomas, this is completely outrageous." She sighed loudly, rubbing her temples as if my survival was an unbearable inconvenience to her busy schedule. $75 for a single medication refill. You really need to ask your primary doctor for a cheaper generic alternative. We are trying to build a stable future here, and your constant medical expenses are eating into our tight household budget. We cannot afford to just throw our hard-earned money out the window every month. I simply nodded, apologizing profusely, in a frail, quiet voice while internally marveling at the monstrous hypocrisy happening right in front of my face. She was bitterly complaining about a $75 prescription medication that kept me alive while tightly clutching a $5,000 purse bought entirely with my stolen life savings. I swallowed my rising anger and slowly retreated to my bedroom. I realized that arguing with them would only accelerate their vicious plans. I needed them to feel completely comfortable. I needed them to remain blindly arrogant. Extreme arrogance always leads to careless mistakes, and Brad was making plenty of them. He began taking his private business calls out on the open outdoor patio, foolishly assuming my aging hearing was far too poor to catch his secretive conversations. He would speak in hushed, hurried tones, frantically, pacing back and forth across the imported stone tiles. I would sit silently by the slightly cracked window of my ground-floor suite, completely hidden behind the thick linen curtains, carefully listening to every single word he spoke. I meticulously memorized names, specific dates, and the panicked excuses he gave to his unknown financial partners over the phone. The fake cosmetics company Monica claimed to run was rapidly bleeding cash, and Brad was desperately trying to cover those massive losses by siphoning more hidden funds from my rapidly depleting pension account. They were dangerously living on a terrifying financial cliff, aggressively burning through my stolen money far faster than they could effectively launder it. But my small pension alone would never sustain their reckless, extravagant lifestyle for very long. They desperately needed a much bigger payout to survive their mounting debts. The true terrifying depth of their cruelty was fully revealed to me on a quiet Thursday night. A heavy, dark thunderstorm had suddenly rolled in from the coast, completely masking any small sounds within the large house. I woke up near midnight feeling a strange, heavy tension lingering in the cold air. I stepped out of my warm bed and walked quietly down the deeply shadowed hallway. The bright fluorescent light from Brad's home office was brightly spilling out from beneath the heavy wooden door. I crept much closer, firmly pressing my back against the cool plaster wall, holding my breath completely still. Brad was speaking frantically on his cell phone, his tight voice deeply laced with pure venom and rising panic. "I do not care about the profit margins," he screamed angrily into the receiver, forcefully slamming his clenched fist onto the solid oak desk. "Just make the wire transfer happen immediately." The old man is completely clueless. He spends all day just staring at the living room wall. He has absolutely no idea his savings accounts are completely empty. I just need a few more short weeks to fully drain the last drops of his pension, and then we finally dump him. We will stick him in the absolute cheapest state ward we can find in the city, and finally be totally done with this miserable, exhausting babysitting job once and for all. I tightly closed my eyes, letting the harsh, freezing reality wash over my entire body. They were not just stealing my hard-earned financial security. They were actively, coldly planning to completely dispose of me, to throw me away like useless garbage the very moment my bank accounts hit absolute zero. My physical utility to them, was almost completely expired. I silently stepped away from the glowing office door and slowly retreated back into the dark shadows of my silent room. My heart pounded rhythmically against my ribs, driven by a new, relentless purpose. The time for passive, quiet observation was officially over. I could no longer just stand by and watch them ruthlessly dismantle the final years of my life, piece by piece. I had to stop them before they could execute their final devastating blow. It was time to stop watching. It was time to actively strike back. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring into the dark room, feeling a profound transformation taking place deep inside my soul. The grieving widower was dead. The vulnerable father was gone. I was a man who knew exactly how to build an unbreakable foundation, and I now knew precisely how to trigger a catastrophic structural collapse. I spent the remainder of the long night carefully drawing up a mental blueprint for absolute destruction. I would give them the rope they so desperately wanted, but I would be the one to firmly pull the heavy lever. The steel trap was finally set. It was time to make a very important call to my old corporate attorney, Gregory Pierce. The morning sun cast long, cold shadows across the marble floors of the mansion as I shuffled into the kitchen. I deliberately dragged my feet, forcing a slight tremor into my hands as I poured my morning coffee. Brad and Monica were already there, dressed in their immaculate corporate attire, discussing their upcoming weekend getaway. Monica was casually scrolling through her phone, browsing for luxury hotel upgrades, while Brad complained about his country club membership. They did not even acknowledge my presence, assuming I was completely absorbed in my own fragile, aging world. I sat at the island quietly sipping my dark coffee, listening to the very people who had ruthlessly drained my life savings complain about minor inconveniences. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to slam my coffee mug onto the granite counter, to demand answers, to confront them with the shredded bank statements I had painstakingly pieced together the night before. But my decades as a civil engineer had taught me that explosive reactions only cause collateral damage. You do not tear down a compromised building by hitting it with a hammer. You strategically place explosives at the critical load-bearing pillars. I nodded politely when Monica told me to wipe down the counters, acting the part of the obedient, subdued burden. I waited exactly 45 minutes after the garage door closed behind their luxury vehicle. Once the house was completely silent, I retrieved a prepaid cell phone I had purchased with cash years ago for work emergencies. I dialed a number I knew by heart. The man on the other end of the line was Gregory Pierce. Gregory was not a friendly neighborhood solicitor. He was a vicious, razor-sharp corporate attorney who had represented my engineering firm during some of the most brutal contract disputes of the past 3 decades. He was a man who navigated legal warfare with cold, calculated precision. We had maintained a quiet friendship over the years, bound by a mutual respect for strategy and logic. When he answered, I did not waste time with pleasantries. I simply told him I needed to see him immediately off the books regarding a catastrophic breach of trust. He recognized the gravity in my tone instantly and told me to use his private back entrance in 1 hour. I slipped out of the Seattle mansion, taking a brisk walk to a nearby commercial plaza, where I hailed a taxi, ensuring my son would not receive any notifications from a ride-sharing application. The drive to Gregory's downtown office gave me time to mentally organize my evidence. I carried the damp, reconstructed shreds of my bank statements in a sealed plastic folder, along with the fresh transaction records the bank manager had provided. When I arrived, Gregory was waiting for me in his massive dark wood-paneled office overlooking the gray city skyline. He poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and motioned for me to sit. I laid the documents on his polished desk. I explained everything without a single trace of emotion. I told him how Brad had convinced me to consolidate my savings to buy the house, how they had systematically drained the funds into Monica's fake cosmetic company, and how I had discovered their ultimate plan to dump me in a state facility once my pension was entirely exhausted. Gregory listened in absolute silence. His sharp eyes scanned the bank records, his jaw tightening with every line of stolen money he read. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair, steepling his fingers. He looked at me with a mixture of deep sympathy and professional fury. "Thomas," he began, his voice dangerously quiet. "This is a highly organized, systemic financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. It is a severe felony. But the complication is that you willingly signed the joint account authorizations. They manipulated you, yes, but legally they had access to those funds. Recovering the liquid cash will be a long, brutal battle in civil court, and they will try to drain it further in legal fees. But the house, Thomas, the house is the real problem. You put $800,000 into a property that Brad and Monica occupy. If they put their names on that deed, extracting your equity is going to be incredibly difficult. They will claim it was a gift." I watched Gregory process the grim legal reality, and for the first time in weeks, a genuine cold smile touched my lips. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a separate, thick, blue-bound document. I placed it squarely in the center of his desk. I tapped the heavy parchment paper with my index finger. "Gregory," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of the frailty I had shown my son. "I spent 40 years designing bridges and skyscrapers. I have never once in my life built a structure without installing a massive, redundant safety failsafe. When Brad presented me with the closing documents for the mansion 8 months ago, I was grieving my beautiful wife. I was exhausted, and I was vulnerable. But I am not stupid." Gregory frowned, pulling the blue-bound document toward him. He flipped open the cover, his eyes rapidly scanning the dense legal text. I continued speaking as he read. Brad assumes he owns this house because he pays the homeowners association dues and the monthly utility bills. He assumes the deed is in his name because he handled the initial negotiations with the real estate agent. But on the morning of the closing, before I wired my money, I made a private detour to an estate planner. I did not purchase this property in Brad's name, nor did I purchase it jointly. I nested the entire transaction, the deed, the title, and the full equity directly into a specialized, irrevocable living trust. Gregory's eyes widened as he turned the pages, reading the specific clauses I had demanded. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on his desk. The trust is the sole legal owner of the Seattle mansion, I explained. And I, Thomas Caldwell, am the sole uncontested trustee. Brad and Monica are merely listed as temporary conditional occupants at my personal discretion. They hold zero equity. They have zero ownership rights. They cannot sell it, they cannot borrow against it, and they cannot claim a single square inch of the property. I own the ground they walk on. I own the roof over their heads. A heavy, cold, electric silence filled the luxurious office. Gregory finished reading the final page. He slowly closed the blue folder, letting out a low, disbelieving breath. He looked up at me, and a slow, sinister smirk spread across his face. He shook his head slowly, in pure admiration. "You let them believe they had completely conquered you," he whispered. "They think they are financial masterminds, but they are living in a fortress that you have the absolute power to demolish today. The house is 100% yours to sell. But Thomas, do not kick them out just yet. You must let them commit a major felony first so they can never come back at you again." Gregory leaned across his massive desk, his expression hardening into a look of absolute determination. He understood the irrevocable trust was our ultimate shield, but not our sword. To ensure Brad and Monica could never challenge the trust or retaliate with legal fabrications, we needed undeniable documented proof of their criminal intent. We needed them caught dead to rights in the act of financial sabotage. Gregory told me that wire transfers and bank statements were excellent circumstantial evidence, but a clever defense attorney could spin those as authorized gifts or simple misunderstandings. To completely destroy their narrative, Gregory insisted we needed audio and visual confirmation of their malice. He pulled out a sleek black business card containing only a single phone number. He explained that the number belonged to a private security contractor, a former intelligence officer who specialized in discreet corporate surveillance and gathering hard evidence for high-stakes litigation. Gregory promised the man was entirely off the books, completely loyal, and devastatingly effective. I took the card, feeling the heavy embossed cardstock between my fingers. I nodded my silent agreement. The next morning, the perfect opportunity presented itself on a silver platter. Brad and Monica bounded into the kitchen, their faces flushed with the arrogant excitement of people spending money they did not earn. Monica was practically vibrating with joy as she announced they were flying down to Napa Valley for an exclusive invite-only weekend wine-tasting gala. She rattled off the names of the luxury vineyards and the 5-star boutique hotel they had booked, oblivious to the sick irony that my liquidated retirement savings were funding their extravagant indulgence. Brad casually mentioned they would be leaving Friday morning and returning late Sunday night. He instructed me to keep the doors locked, avoid touching the thermostat, and stick to the prepackaged meals Monica had stacked in the refrigerator. I offered them a frail, appreciative smile. I told them to have a wonderful time and promised I would not cause any trouble while they were away. I played the role of the docile, grateful dependent with absolute perfection. I watched from the living room window as their sleek town car pulled out of the driveway Friday morning. The moment the vehicle disappeared around the bend of our affluent street, I dialed the number Gregory had given me. The security contractor arrived 2 hours later in a completely unmarked, ordinary gray van. He was a tall, remarkably unremarkable-looking man who introduced himself simply as David. He did not ask any unnecessary questions about my family or my motivations. He only asked for the specific parameters of the surveillance and a detailed layout of the property. I guided him through the sprawling mansion, pointing out the areas where Brad conducted his late-night business calls and where Monica frequently reviewed her fraudulent company ledgers. I directed David specifically to Brad's home office and the formal living room. David worked with a terrifyingly efficient speed. He produced a sophisticated kit of micro cameras, each lens no larger than the head of a pin. He seamlessly integrated the devices into the surrounding environment. In the living room, a camera vanished into the intricate molding of a decorative bookshelf, providing a panoramic view of the seating area where Monica often held court. In Brad's office, the installation was even more masterful. David embedded a tiny lens directly into the casing of a high-end air purifier, sitting on the corner of the desk, perfectly angled to capture the computer monitor and anyone sitting in the heavy leather executive chair. These cameras were not the cheap, grainy security devices one might find at a hardware store. They were military-grade instruments equipped with high-definition night vision and extremely sensitive audio receivers capable of picking up a whisper from across the room. After completing the physical installation, David walked me through the software setup. He downloaded a highly encrypted application directly onto my phone. He showed me how the system operated on a closed, secure loop completely invisible to the house's main internet router. The application featured a motion-activated alert system. Anytime someone entered those specific rooms, the cameras would silently power on, begin recording, and send a silent notification directly to my device. I handed David an envelope of cash, thanked him for his swift professionalism, and locked the front door behind him. The Seattle mansion was no longer their safe haven. It was now my fully operational observation deck. The trap was set, but a trap is entirely useless without the proper bait. I needed Brad to act. I needed him to actively demonstrate his predatory intentions on camera. On Sunday evening, hours before they returned from their luxurious weekend, I manufactured the bait. Using heavy paper, I printed a highly realistic official-looking letterhead from a national pension management firm. Inside the envelope, I drafted a fake financial summary detailing an untouched secondary retirement annuity. I purposefully fabricated the numbers to look incredibly enticing, formatting the document to show a newly matured sum of $450,000, fully liquid and ready for immediate withdrawal. I added a bold red sticky note to the front, writing a reminder to myself in shaky handwriting to call the broker regarding a complete account rollover. I walked into Brad's office and placed the heavy envelope directly in the center of his immaculate mahogany desk. I positioned it so it was impossible to miss, right next to his expensive fountain pen. I knew Brad. I knew his insatiable greed. The moment he saw a new, untapped reservoir of cash, his complete lack of moral restraint would take over. He would not be able to resist opening that envelope. Brad and Monica returned late Sunday night, exhausted but glowing from their decadent weekend. I greeted them in the hallway, shuffling my feet, and politely asking how the wine tasting was. Monica ignored me completely, heading straight upstairs. Brad gave me a dismissive nod and complained about the traffic. For the next 3 days, I maintained my flawless facade. I sat in my recliner, watched television, and acted like the oblivious old man they believed me to be. The tension inside my chest was nearly unbearable. I constantly checked my phone, waiting for the notification that would seal their fate. The first 3 days passed in agonizing silence. The bait remained untouched on the desk. But on the 4th afternoon, the heavy rain returned, casting a gloomy shadow over the entire house. I was sitting in my room when my phone screen suddenly illuminated. A silent, urgent notification popped up on the encrypted application. Motion detected in the home office. My pulse accelerated instantly. I opened the application and tapped the live feed. The high-definition video stream loaded perfectly. There was Brad standing in the middle of his office, his eyes completely locked on the heavy envelope I had left on his desk. I watched him look over his shoulder, ensuring the hallway was empty. He closed the office door behind him with a soft click. He stepped toward the desk, reached out his hand, and eagerly picked up the bait. I was sitting on a cold, damp bench in a small community park about 3 miles from the Seattle mansion, gripping my smartphone, with both hands. The icy drizzle soaked through the shoulders of my wool coat, but I did not feel the chill. My entire focus was completely locked on the high-definition digital stream broadcasting live from my own home. I watched through the hidden microcamera as Brad stood in the center of his opulent mahogany-paneled office, his fingers hungrily tearing into the thick envelope I had left as bait. His eyes darted rapidly across the fabricated financial summary. Even through the small screen of my phone, I could clearly see the sudden feverish flush of pure greed spreading across his face. He actually licked his lips. He believed he had just discovered an untouched hidden reserve of $450,000. He tossed the fake statement onto his desk and immediately began pacing back and forth, dragging his hands through his hair as he processed this sudden windfall. But Brad was not a man who possessed the virtue of patience. He did not want to wait to manipulate me into signing over this newly discovered annuity. He wanted liquid cash, and he wanted it immediately to cover the gaping, bleeding holes in Monica's fraudulent cosmetics company. I watched as he stopped pacing, walked over to a heavy filing cabinet, and unlocked the bottom drawer. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and slammed them down next to my fabricated bait. The camera resolution was spectacular. By simply pinching the screen of my phone, I could zoom in close enough to read the bold black header printed across the top page of the stack. It was a home equity line of credit application. Brad had already prepared the paperwork to leverage the Seattle mansion. He was attempting to secure a massive loan against the property, borrowing $500,000 in liquid cash against a house he mistakenly believed was registered in his own name. What my arrogant son did not realize was that the bank underwriting this massive loan would eventually conduct a deep title search. They would inevitably discover the fundamental discrepancy. They would see that the deed was safely locked inside an irrevocable living trust, completely impenetrable, and entirely beyond his legal reach. The loan would ultimately be flagged and denied. But the ultimate approval of the loan was completely irrelevant to me now. It did not matter if the bank gave him the money. What mattered was the specific sequence of actions Brad was about to perform. By willfully falsifying financial documents and transmitting them across state lines to a federal banking institution, he was stepping over a very dark, very permanent legal line. He was moving from simple financial exploitation into the realm of severe federal crimes. I held my breath as Brad pulled a blue ink pen from his expensive desk set. He reached into another drawer and pulled out a stack of my old canceled checks. He arranged them in a neat row across the top of the desk, staring intently at the cursive loops and sharp angles of my personal signature. He took a piece of blank scrap paper and began to practice. Over and over again, I watched my own son meticulously copy the exact strokes of my name. He adjusted the angle of his wrist, modified the pressure of the pen, and practiced the slight natural tremor that had recently developed in my aging hands. It was a sickening, mesmerizing performance. He was stealing my identity with the focused, cold dedication of a professional criminal. After 5 minutes of continuous practice, he leaned back, seemingly satisfied with his dark handiwork. He pulled the official home equity line of credit application toward him, smoothing out the thick paper. Without a single moment of hesitation or moral conflict, Brad pressed the pen to the signature line. He forged my name with absolute precision. He signed away my supposed equity, falsely binding me to $500,000 of toxic, unmanageable debt. He flipped to the next page and forged my signature a second time, then a third. My heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I was literally watching him weave his own inescapable snare. He gathered the signed documents, walked over to the sleek, flatbed scanner sitting on the corner of his credenza, and fed the pages into the machine. I watched him return to his computer, click his mouse a few times, and formally upload the fraudulent application to the banking portal. The submission was complete. The federal wire fraud was officially committed, electronically stamped, and forever preserved on the hidden servers of the security contractor Gregory had hired. The trap had flawlessly snapped shut. I had him. I let out a long, shaky breath, feeling a sudden, overwhelming wave of profound exhaustion wash over me. The adrenaline that had been keeping me sharply focused began to slowly drain away. I had captured the undeniable concrete proof Gregory Pierce needed to completely annihilate them in a court of law. I had won. I reached out my thumb to close the application and finally step out of the freezing rain, but a sudden flash of movement on the screen made me freeze. The heavy oak door to the home office swung open, and Monica stepped into the frame. She was wearing her expensive workout clothes, her hair pulled back into a tight, severe ponytail. She did not look at the scanner or the stack of forged documents scattered across the desk. Her focus was entirely on Brad, and her expression was unnervingly calm, almost entirely devoid of human emotion. Brad looked up from his monitor, a victorious, arrogant smirk plastered across his face. He pointed at the fabricated pension statement I had left as bait. "Look at this," he said, his voice buzzing with greedy excitement. "The old fool has another 450 grand stashed away in a secondary annuity account. I just found it today. I just pushed through the equity line on the house to cover our immediate vendor debts, but we can easily bleed this new account dry by the end of next month. We are completely saved, Monica. We are totally in the clear." Monica did not smile. She did not celebrate. She slowly walked over to the desk and stood directly in front of the hidden camera. She reached into the pocket of her designer athletic jacket and pulled out a small amber-colored plastic cylinder. She placed it gently onto the pristine mahogany surface of the desk. The camera lens was positioned perfectly. I could clearly read the white pharmaceutical label wrapping around the small bottle. It was my prescription heart medication, the vital daily pills I needed to keep my blood pressure regulated and my weak heart steadily beating. "I do not want to wait until the end of next month, Brad," Monica said, her voice dropping to a terrifying icy whisper that chilled the blood running through my veins far more than the freezing Seattle rain ever could. "I am completely sick of looking at him. I am sick of the way he shuffles around my kitchen. I am sick of pretending to care." She reached out and casually tapped the small plastic bottle with her perfectly manicured fingernail. The plastic rattled softly against the heavy wood of the desk. "I was doing some research online this afternoon while you were busy playing banker," she continued, leaning closer to her husband. "If an elderly man with a documented history of severe cardiac issues simply forgets to take his medication for a few consecutive days, nature takes its course very quickly. A sudden massive heart attack would be completely expected. The coroner would not ask any questions. The police would not bat an eye. It would just be a tragic, natural conclusion to a long, full life. And as his sole surviving heirs and the designated executors of his estate, we get direct, immediate access to absolutely everything he owns without having to jump through all these exhausting legal hoops. We do not need to slowly bleed that new account, Brad. We can just take the whole damn thing by Friday. All we have to do is replace these little pills with generic sugar capsules and let biology handle the rest of our problems." Brad shook his head, leaning back in his leather chair. "No," he said. "A sudden heart attack is too messy. Insurance companies ask questions. Medical examiners look for anomalies. If he dies right after I secure a massive line of credit, the bank might freeze the assets. We need something predictable, something that legally strips his power without raising a red flag." Monica frowned, tapping the plastic prescription bottle. "Then what exactly is your brilliant alternative?" she asked. Brad pulled a glass vial from his pocket, placing it next to my heart medication. "This," he whispered. "I paid a discreet contact for this compound. It is a concentrated chemical sedative. It is completely tasteless, odorless, and nearly impossible to trace. Over the past 3 weeks, I have been mixing microdoses of it into the herbal tea you brew for him every evening. Have you not noticed how incredibly sluggish he has become lately? How he forgets simple conversations and sleeps for 12 hours? A paralyzing dread washed over me as I sat on the park bench staring at my phone. The rainy Seattle afternoon faded away, leaving only the terrifying reality of his words. I had blamed my recent exhaustion, mental fog, and sudden memory lapses on grief and advancing age. I thought I was simply growing old. The horrifying truth was that my own flesh and blood had been poisoning me in the very home I purchased for them. Monica picked up the glass vial, gently shaking it to watch the clear liquid swirl. "Are you sure this dosage is enough?" she asked, a chilling pragmatism settling into her tone. "It is enough," Brad replied. "Just keep slipping it in his tea. We increased the dosage over the next 14 days. By the time the home equity line of credit clears, his cognitive functions will be decimated. He will not even know his own name. Once the funds are secured, we call his doctor and express deep concern over his rapid mental decline. The doctor will evaluate him, see the induced dementia symptoms, and we will step in as his medical proxies. We will legally commit him to the state ward for his safety. We get absolute control of the estate, and he fades away in a locked room where no one will ever listen to his rambling." I lowered my smartphone, my hands shaking so violently I nearly dropped the device. The rain soaked my hair, but I could not feel the cold. An infernal fire ignited deep within my chest. They were not simply stealing my life savings to fund their extravagant lifestyle. They were actively destroying my physical mind. They were orchestrating the chemical erasure of my identity, planning to lock me inside an induced prison of dementia. The evil of their strategy was breathtaking. They were weaponizing my trust, using the evening tea my daughter-in-law handed me each night as a lethal delivery system. I sat on that bench, allowing the magnitude of their betrayal to calcify my heart. Any foolish hope that my son might find his moral compass was permanently eradicated. They were predators, and I was their prey. But they made a fatal miscalculation. They severely underestimated the analytical mind of an old structural engineer. I stood up, my legs feeling strong and steady. The heavy lethargy that plagued me for 3 weeks suddenly made perfect sense, and with that realization came a surge of clarity. I knew how to dismantle their operation. I hailed a taxi back to the mansion. The house was quiet. Brad and Monica were sequestered in the home office, unaware that I possessed a recording of their murderous conspiracy. I walked straight into the kitchen. The ceramic teapot was sitting on the marble island, still warm from Monica's preparations. Beside it sat my favorite ceramic mug filled with the dark herbal tea. I stared at the steaming liquid, a wave of nausea rolling through my stomach. I carefully picked up the mug, walked to the sink, and silently poured the entire contents down the drain. I rinsed the mug, leaving a tiny drop at the bottom to make it appear as though I had consumed every drop. For the next 2 days, I continued the grueling performance. When Monica handed me the brewed cup of poison each evening, I offered her a grateful smile. I would take the cup to my room, lock the door, and flush the lethal liquid down the toilet. I diligently practiced slurring my words during our brief morning interactions. I purposely forgot where I placed my reading glasses and manufactured a confused shuffle when I walked down the hallway. I watched with grim satisfaction as Brad and Monica exchanged victorious glances. They truly believed their chemical cocktail was working perfectly. They believed I was slipping into the dark abyss of dementia. On the morning of the 3rd day after they had driven away in their luxury sedan, I dropped the pathetic charade entirely. My mind was completely clear, the residual effects of the sedative having finally flushed from my system. I gathered the digital storage drive containing the encrypted security footage, placed it carefully into my leather briefcase, and called a taxi. I directed the driver straight to downtown Seattle, to the towering glass building where Gregory Pierce conducted his ruthless legal warfare. When I entered Gregory's wood-paneled office, he immediately noticed the stark change in my physical demeanor. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, my eyes burning with a cold, relentless focus. I did not wait for him to offer me a seat. I walked over to his massive desk, opened my briefcase, and placed the digital storage drive directly in front of him. The polished surface of the desk reflected the severe expression etched across my face. I pulled up the video file on my phone and placed it where he could see it. I pressed play. I watched Gregory's face as he listened to the clear audio of my own son and daughter-in-law plotting my chemical lobotomy. I watched the seasoned attorney grow visibly pale as the sheer depravity of their conversation filled the office. When the video ended, Gregory remained silent for a long moment. He slowly looked up at me, his sharp eyes reflecting a deep intensity. He understood perfectly that this was no longer a simple matter of financial exploitation. This was an active, documented conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm. Gregory took a deep breath, resting his hands flat on the desk. "Thomas," he said softly, "this changes absolutely everything. We are no longer just protecting your assets. We are involving the federal authorities, and they are facing decades in prison for this." I looked at him feeling absolutely no remorse, no hesitation, and no fear. I had given them every opportunity to simply be greedy, but they had actively chosen to be monstrous. They wanted to destroy my mind, so I will destroy their future. I placed my hands on the edge of his desk, leaning in close. "No more waiting," I said, my voice as hard as cold steel. "It is time to burn their world down." Gregory leaned back in his heavy leather chair, his sharp eyes evaluating me with a newfound, profound respect. He did not offer any empty platitudes or hollow words of comfort. He understood that my survival depended entirely on swift, brutal action. "We need to liquidate the Seattle property immediately," he said, pulling a legal pad across his desk. "The irrevocable living trust gives you the absolute authority to sell the house without their consent or knowledge. However, a traditional real estate transaction takes 30 to 60 days. You have to list it, show it, wait for appraisals, and navigate mortgage approvals. With them actively poisoning you, we do not have 30 days. We need a buyer who can bypass the conventional market entirely." I agreed completely. I told Gregory to find a way to sever my physical and financial ties to the house with maximum velocity. He immediately picked up his phone and began making calls, completely bypassing traditional real estate brokers. He reached out directly to a private network of aggressive corporate real estate investment firms. These were massive holding companies that specialized in acquiring luxury properties for cash, often sight unseen, relying solely on public tax records, property histories, and satellite imagery to evaluate their massive investments. They moved with predatory speed, capitalizing on distressed sales and motivated sellers who needed liquid capital overnight. By late Tuesday afternoon, Gregory had successfully located a highly motivated buyer. It was a massive corporate holding group based out of California. They specialized in acquiring premium real estate at significantly discounted rates, flipping them or adding them to their elite rental portfolios. Gregory summoned me back to his office to present their preliminary offer. They were extremely interested in the Seattle mansion, primarily due to its exclusive location and pristine condition. They were fully prepared to wire millions of dollars in pure cash directly into my protected trust account, completely sidestepping any mortgage lenders or financing delays. However, their incredible speed came with a very steep price. The California firm demanded a massive 20% discount below the current market value of the property. For a house worth millions, that represented a staggering financial loss of equity. Gregory warned me that it was a brutal haircut. He advised that if we waited just a few more weeks, we could easily secure full market value. But the money was entirely secondary to me now. My primary objective was immediate survival and absolute devastating revenge. I did not care about maximizing profit. I only cared about pulling the physical ground out from under my treacherous son and his murderous wife. I looked Gregory squarely in the eye and told him I would gladly accept the 20% financial hit, but only if they agreed to my own set of ruthless, uncompromising conditions. I outlined my terms with cold mathematical precision. First, there could be no standard escrow period. I demanded a same-day, 2-hour closing process from the moment the final documents were signed. Second, and most importantly, I required the buyer to take full physical possession of the property the very second the funds cleared the federal wire. There would be no grace periods granted to the current occupants. There would be no standard 30-day eviction notices. I demanded an immediate forceful eviction of Brad and Monica handled directly by the corporate buyers, private property managers, and local law enforcement. Gregory conveyed my aggressive terms to the California holding group. To my absolute satisfaction, the corporate buyers loved the brutal efficiency of the proposed deal. They employed their own teams of highly aggressive property managers who actually specialized in hostile takeovers and immediate evictions. They formally agreed to every single condition. Gregory immediately mobilized his legal team. They began frantically drafting the immense stack of necessary transfer documents, the deed assignments, the trust authorizations, and the strict immediate eviction mandates. The legal machinery was finally moving at full speed, preparing a devastating strike that Brad and Monica would never see coming. While Gregory prepared the final legal warhead, I was forced to return to the massive Seattle mansion. I had to continue my grueling undercover performance. I maintained my flawless facade of a rapidly declining, confused old man. Every evening I graciously accepted the cup of poisoned herbal tea from Monica, flashing her a weak, ignorant smile. Every evening I carried the mug into my ground-floor suite, locked the heavy wooden door, and quietly poured the lethal liquid down the bathroom sink. I continued to slur my words during breakfast. I purposefully left my shoes in the refrigerator and pretended to forget my own middle name. Brad and Monica were absolutely thrilled with my apparent rapid cognitive deterioration. But beneath their cruel celebration, I could clearly sense Brad's mounting desperation. His fraudulent home equity line of credit application had not cleared the banking system yet. The massive loan he was attempting to secure was inevitably crawling through the underwriting process, moving much too slowly for his urgent needs. The various hidden creditors funding Monica's fake luxury cosmetic company were calling him relentlessly. He was desperately pacing the outdoor patio every single night, sweating through his expensive dress shirts as he frantically promised payments he did not possess. He desperately needed liquid cash to bridge his massive financial gap. With the bank loan stalled, Brad inevitably set his greedy sights on the very last remaining drop of my personal wealth. He focused entirely on the small monthly pension check that was automatically deposited into my isolated checking account. It was the only money they had not yet managed to completely siphon away. Gregory called me on my encrypted mobile device late Wednesday night. He confirmed that the immense stack of paperwork was perfectly finalized. The aggressive California investment firm had fully authorized the massive cash transfer. The funds were queued and ready to be deployed. We simply needed to officially select the exact execution date and time to sign the final closing documents. I stood by the window of my dark room watching the endless Seattle rain fall against the cold glass. I mentally reviewed my precise internal calendar. I knew exactly when Brad would finally reach his absolute breaking point. I knew exactly when his profound greed would overpower his fragile patience. I told Gregory to schedule the final official closing for the following Thursday morning at exactly 9 o'clock. That was the precise day my monthly pension deposit cleared the banking system. It was a sum of exactly $13,000. I knew my son better than he knew himself. I knew Brad was planning to violently confront me that very morning. I knew he was planning to ruthlessly demand the last $13,000 I had to my name to cover his impending defaults. I fully intended to let him demand that money. I would let the brutal confrontation happen right in the middle of that opulent living room. I would look him in the eye as his mask completely slipped. I would willingly endure the physical violence, the threats, and the ultimate indignity. I would stand there and quietly take the 13 slaps he was about to deliver, knowing with absolute, unshakable certainty that the very moment he violently raised his hand against me, the ink would already be drying on the legal documents that guaranteed his absolute, total, and permanent destruction. The stage was perfectly set for Thursday morning. The demolition was fully authorized. The trap was ready to spring shut forever, sealing their catastrophic fate. I would finally show my son the horrific, irreversible consequences of pushing a brilliant, calculating engineer entirely too far. They believed they were hunting a vulnerable, broken man, completely unaware they had willingly stepped inside a meticulously designed cage. The foundation of their stolen empire was rigged with legal explosives, and I was holding the detonator. All I had to do was smile, accept the abuse, and wait for the precise mathematical second to press the button. The countdown to absolute ruin had officially begun. Thursday morning arrived with a heavy grayness that mirrored the cold concrete of my resolve. I woke up before the sun pierced the Seattle clouds. I lay still in the darkness of my ground floor suite, listening to the drumming of the rain. Every muscle in my body felt tense, tightly coiled like a steel spring about to snap. I dressed myself in a clean pair of slacks and a simple gray sweater. I looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The face staring back at me was weathered, lined with grief and the exhaustion of playing a submissive victim. But my eyes were sharp, clear, and burning with a fierce anticipation. I knew exactly what was coming. I had engineered this precise moment down to the last fraction of a second. I walked down the hallway and entered the massive marble-covered kitchen. I prepared my usual bland bowl of oatmeal and sat at the island, intentionally hunching my shoulders perfectly, embodying the frail, useless old man they needed me to be. The house remained silent for another 20 minutes until heavy footsteps echoed down the staircase. Brad stormed into the kitchen. His designer suit was slightly wrinkled, and his face was drawn tight with panic and sleeplessness. He did not bother to pour coffee. He marched toward me, his breathing shallow and rapid. He slammed both of his hands flat onto the granite countertop, leaning in close. His eyes were bloodshot and devoid of any trace of familial affection. He was a desperate animal, backed into a corner of his own making. "Where is the pension deposit?" he demanded, his voice dropping into a growl. It cleared the bank at midnight. I checked the joint portal. The $13,000 is sitting there now. I need it transferred to the household operations account this exact second. I kept my head bowed, letting my spoon rattle weakly against the edge of my bowl. I looked up at him with wide, confused eyes. "But Brad," I whispered, forcing a tremor into my vocal cords, "that money is for my medical bills and my property taxes. I cannot transfer the entire balance. We talked about this. You said you had everything under control." Brad let out a sharp laugh that sounded unhinged. Under control, he mocked, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "Nothing is under control. You are living in my house. You are eating my food. You are a burden on my life, and you are going to pay your fair share. Transfer the money now." I slowly shook my head, keeping my hands resting flat on the cold counter. "I am sorry, son," I said softly. "I cannot do that." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched the final thread of his manufactured patience snap in real time. He did not yell or argue. He simply reached across the marble island, grabbed the collar of my gray sweater, and yanked me up from the stool. My bowl of oatmeal shattered onto the floor. He dragged me into the center of the kitchen. "You ungrateful, miserable old parasite!" he hissed through tightly clenched teeth. He raised his right hand, and the first strike landed heavily against my left cheek. The sharp, stinging crack echoed off the custom cabinets. I stumbled backward, tasting bitter copper in my mouth, but I did not fall. I stayed perfectly silent, keeping my eyes locked firmly on the floor. He struck me again, a brutal slap that forcefully snapped my head to the side. 2. Then came the third. 4. 5. Each vicious strike was fueled by his sheer desperation, his mounting debt, and his blind arrogance. He truly believed he was dominating a weak, defenseless target. He falsely believed he was physically beating me into total submission. 6. 7. 8. I focused my mind entirely on the pure mathematics of the situation. Every stinging blow to my aging face was simply another massive nail securely hammered into his permanent legal coffin. 9. 10. 11. My ears were ringing loudly, and a dull, throbbing pain radiated across my jaw, but deep inside my chest I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, magnificent victory. 12. 13. He finally stopped breathing heavily, his chest heaving with extreme exertion. He stood over me, smoothing the lapels of his expensive suit jacket, looking down with a mask of absolute victorious contempt. "You will go to the bank the very second they open," he ordered, pointing a trembling, aggressive finger directly at my face. "You will withdraw that $13,000 in cash, and you will place it exactly on my desk by noon. If that money is not waiting for me when I get home, you will be sleeping on the damp, freezing streets tonight. Do you understand me?" I nodded slowly, allowing a single tear to fall down my bruised cheek. "I understand, Brad," I whispered. He sneered, turning sharply on his heel. He grabbed his leather briefcase from the hallway table and slammed the heavy front door behind him with terrifying force. I stood perfectly frozen in the center of the quiet kitchen, listening closely as the powerful engine of his luxury vehicle loudly roared to life. I waited patiently until the sound of the tires completely faded down the suburban street. The very second complete silence returned to the massive house, my frail, hunched posture instantly vanished. I stood perfectly straight, rolling my stiff shoulders and gently touching my bruised, stinging cheek. I felt absolutely no sadness. I felt no lingering heartbreak for the son I had officially lost. He had chosen his own brutal path. I walked back to my bedroom, completely ignoring the spilled oatmeal on the floor. I grabbed my heavy wool coat and my leather briefcase containing my secure phone and my personal identification. I did not look back as I stepped out of the front door and walked confidently down the long paved driveway. The cold, biting morning air felt incredibly refreshing against my swollen face. Parked exactly at the curb was a long, sleek black town car. The rear door immediately swung open as I approached. Gregory Pierce was sitting in the back seat, holding a blue-bound legal folder in his lap. I climbed inside, the smell of premium leather enveloping me. Gregory looked at my bruised face, his jaw clenching, but he maintained his absolute professional composure. "The corporate buyers have completely wired the funds." Gregory stated, his voice a steady rumble. "The title transfer is primed and ready for your final signature. We are heading straight to the title office now. The eviction team is standing by, waiting for my signal to move." I nodded, reaching into my pocket. I pulled out my mobile phone and opened the messaging application. I selected Brad's contact profile. I typed out a brief, simple message, making sure every single word was perfectly chosen. "Going to the bank now, son. Getting exactly what you deserve." I pressed send and watched the small indicator confirm the delivery. A few seconds later, my screen illuminated with his immediate, clueless response. It was a single, simple thumbs-up emoji. I put the phone into my pocket. Gregory's town car glided through the rain-soaked streets of downtown Seattle. The silence inside the vehicle contrasted sharply with the violent storm that had erupted in my kitchen. My bruised cheek throbbed, serving as a physical reminder of my son's profound betrayal. But the pain only sharpened my focus. Every passing block brought me closer to total, devastating retribution. As an engineer, I spent my life designing unbreakable foundations. Now I was utilizing those exact principles of structural vulnerability to completely demolish the empire my son attempted to build upon my back. We pulled into the garage of the glass skyscraper housing Gregory's law firm. The private elevator shot us upward, opening directly into a massive conference room overlooking the gray waters of the harbor. Waiting around a polished mahogany table were the representatives of the California corporate investment firm. There were 3 of them. 2 men and 1 woman, all dressed in dark charcoal suits. They radiated an aura of efficiency. They were not there to admire the mansion or discuss the sentimental value of a family home. They were apex predators of the financial world, specializing in rapid acquisitions and ruthless property management. They did not offer smiles, pleasantries, or handshakes. The lead representative, a broad-shouldered man with a severe haircut, tapped a thick stack of legal documents resting in the center of the table. He announced that their banking institution was currently holding the massive wire transfer in a secure digital escrow, waiting only for my authorized signature to release the funds. Gregory sat beside me, transitioning into his role as my legal general. He pulled the stack of documents toward him, adjusting his reading glasses. For 45 minutes, the room was filled only with the sharp sound of turning pages and the quiet murmur of complex legal terminology. Gregory scrutinized every clause, every hidden stipulation, every minor addendum, and every liability waiver. He meticulously ensured that the California firm was purchasing the property entirely, as is completely and unconditionally absorbing the heavy responsibility of removing the current hostile occupants. The corporate representatives sat perfectly still, their expressions completely impassive, fully aware that they were securing a premium multi-million-dollar luxury estate at a massive 20% discount. They were more than willing to handle a forced aggressive eviction in exchange for such an incredibly lucrative financial margin. The palpable tension in the sterile conference room thickened with each passing minute. I sat perfectly upright, my hands resting calmly on the cool, polished surface of the table. I thought about the 13 vicious slaps my son delivered just an hour earlier. I thought about his desperate, greedy eyes, demanding the very last pennies of my modest monthly pension. I thought about Monica casually tapping the amber plastic bottle containing my vital heart medication, coldly calculating the precise timeline of my chemically induced demise. They genuinely believed they were currently sitting in the absolute safety of their conquered fortress, completely unaware that I was presently selling the very ground beneath their feet to a faceless corporation that specialized in ruthless immediate displacement. Gregory finally closed the thick blue-bound file. He perfectly aligned the edges of the heavy parchment paper and pushed the formidable stack directly in front of me. He placed a heavy gold-plated fountain pen right next to the primary signature line. The three California representatives leaned forward slightly, their collective gaze locked entirely on my right hand. This was the absolute point of no return. Once the dark ink bonded with the thick paper, the sprawling Seattle mansion would instantly cease to be my property. It would legally become the corporate asset of an aggressive, unyielding holding company. I picked up the heavy gold pen, feeling its cold weight against my fingers. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a single drop of nostalgic regret for the beautiful estate I had originally purchased with my entire life savings. That house was no longer a home. It was nothing but a hollow monument to their cruel manipulation. I pressed the sharp nib to the paper and signed my name with firm, deliberate, unbreakable strokes. I flipped to the very next page and signed again. I continued methodically through the entire stack, authorizing the deed transfer, acknowledging the discounted sale price, and formally granting the new corporate owners the absolute uncontested legal right to take immediate physical possession of the premises. When I signed the final concluding page, the lead representative immediately picked up his encrypted mobile phone. He did not speak a single word. He simply sent a fast, brief text message directly to his corporate banking team. The heavy, suffocating silence returned to the glass-walled conference room, hanging in the air like a thick, impenetrable fog. We were now waiting for the final digital confirmation of the massive financial transfer. I watched the long second hand sweeping methodically across the white face of the large wall clock. My heart maintained a steady, powerful, rhythmic beat inside my chest. I felt incredibly light, as if a crushing, suffocating, unbearable weight had just been miraculously lifted from my tired shoulders. The toxic, parasitic burden of their boundless greed was finally being permanently severed. Suddenly, Gregory's secure laptop chimed with a sharp, exceptionally clear notification. He quickly typed his complex security password, his sharp eyes intensely scanning the glowing digital banking portal. A slow, deeply satisfied, predatory smile spread across his hardened features. He turned his laptop screen directly toward me. There it was, The multi-million-dollar deposit had successfully cleared the federal banking system. The massive sum of pure liquid cash was now safely nested deep within my impenetrable, heavily fortified, irrevocable living trust account. The money was completely isolated, entirely untraceable, and utterly untouchable by anyone other than myself. Brad could search for 100 years and he would never locate a single penny of those funds. The lead California representative gathered the signed documents, placing them carefully into his leather briefcase. He stood up finally, offering a brief, highly professional nod. "The transaction is complete." "Mr. Caldwell," he stated, his voice completely devoid of any human emotion, "our corporation is now the sole legal owner of the property. We appreciate your highly efficient business." The three representatives turned and exited the conference room, their synchronized footsteps echoing loudly down the marble hallway. I remained seated next to Gregory, staring out the massive window at the relentless Seattle rain. The storm was still raging outside, but my internal war was completely finished. I had reclaimed my total independence. Gregory slowly closed his laptop. He reached across the wide desk and picked up his private office telephone. He dialed a direct, highly secure line, placing the heavy receiver to his ear. His eyes locked onto mine, reflecting the cold, devastating, absolute reality of what was about to unfold. The line connected. Gregory did not offer a pleasant greeting. He spoke with the absolute, uncompromising authority of a man initiating a calculated, catastrophic demolition. "The ink is dry," he commanded, his voice echoing sharply in the quiet room. "Execute the eviction protocol immediately." Miles away from the quiet efficiency of Gregory's law office, Brad was standing at the head of a sleek, glass-walled boardroom, entirely consumed by his own manufactured brilliance. He wore a sharply tailored navy suit, projecting the image of a highly successful corporate executive. He was leading a quarterly sales meeting for a group of regional directors, confidently pointing a laser pointer at a series of upward-trending graphs projected onto a large screen. Brad loved these moments. He loved commanding the attention of the room, listening to his own voice echo off the expensive acoustic panels. As he concluded his presentation on aggressive market expansion, he casually leaned against the edge of the mahogany table and began to brag. He could not resist the constant, desperate urge to publicly inflate his own perceived status. He loudly mentioned his recent exclusive weekend getaway to the Napa Valley wine tasting gala, making absolutely sure to drop the names of the luxury vineyards and the five-star boutique hotel. He chuckled smoothly, telling his colleagues that his personal investment portfolio was about to receive a massive influx of liquid capital, broadly hinting at a brilliant real estate maneuver he had recently orchestrated. He felt like an absolute king, standing at the very pinnacle of his professional and financial power, completely oblivious to the catastrophic reality hurtling toward him. As Brad basked in the polite, envious murmurs of his colleagues, a sharp, repetitive vibration began to rattle against the polished surface of the boardroom table. His smartphone, resting face down next to his presentation notes, was violently buzzing. Brad frowned, momentarily annoyed by the disruption to his victory lap. He ignored the first sequence of vibrations, attempting to smoothly transition into the final phase of his sales pitch. But the phone did not stop. It buzzed with an intense, frantic urgency, rattling loud enough to draw the direct attention of the regional directors sitting closest to him. Assuming it was Monica calling to complain about a minor inconvenience with her fraudulent cosmetic company, Brad casually reached down and flipped the device over. He intended to swiftly silence the screen, but his finger froze, hovering above the glass. The lock screen was completely overflowing with a rapid, cascading sequence of bright red security notifications. It was the mobile application connected directly to the expensive, high-definition video doorbell he had installed at the Seattle mansion. The alerts were not just indicating a single delivery driver or a passing neighborhood dog. The notifications were firing multiple times per second, signaling massive, continuous, heavy movement directly on his front porch. A cold knot of confusion formed in the center of Brad's stomach. He completely lost his train of thought, leaving a regional director, waiting for an answer to a question he had not even heard. Brad hastily swiped his thumb across the screen, entering his passcode to access the live digital feed. The high-resolution video loaded instantly, filling his small screen with a scene of absolute chaotic destruction. He blinked rapidly, utterly incapable of processing the images transmitting from his own front porch. 3 burly men wearing heavy canvas work jackets and thick leather boots were standing directly in front of his custom solid oak front door. One of the men was wielding a massive industrial-grade power drill. Brad watched in paralyzed, muted horror as the man aggressively forced the heavy steel drill bit directly into the center of the expensive brass deadbolt. Sparks flew into the damp Seattle air as the intricate, high-security locking mechanism was completely pulverized in a matter of seconds. The heavy oak door was violently kicked open, slamming backward against the interior foyer wall with a sickening crunch. Brad's breath caught in his throat as the camera feed revealed a massive, coordinated invasion force swarming into his home. A team of 8 broad-shouldered men wearing matching gray uniforms marched aggressively past the shattered doorway. They were a professional, heavy-duty junk removal crew. They moved with a ruthless, calculated efficiency, completely ignoring the luxurious aesthetic of the pristine environment. Brad watched through the digital lens as 2 men disappeared into the formal living room and immediately reappeared carrying Monica's prized, custom-upholstered velvet sofa. They did not carry it with care. They hoisted the heavy piece of furniture into the air, marched it straight out the front door, and unceremoniously hurled it directly onto the wet, manicured grass of the front lawn. Another worker marched out carrying a massive stack of Monica's expensive red-soled designer shoes, casually dumping them into a growing pile of debris on the driveway. A 4th man dragged the massive flat-screen television out by its power cord, dropping it face down onto the concrete pathway. Brad stood at the head of the corporate boardroom, his face draining of all color until his skin was a sickly ashen gray. His professional facade instantly evaporated, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He forgot where he was. He forgot the regional directors staring at him in bewildered silence. He forgot the sales presentation and his arrogant boasting. A guttural, primal scream suddenly ripped through his chest, erupting from his throat and echoing violently off the glass walls of the quiet boardroom. "Hey!" he roared at the small screen in his hand, his voice cracking with pure, desperate panic. "Get out of my house! What are you doing? Get your hands off my property!" The heavy plastic laser pointer slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly onto the mahogany table. He knocked over his glass of water, sending a dark stain soaking through his presentation notes, but he did not notice. He was completely captivated by the live broadcast of his entire life being violently dismantled and thrown into the mud. His colleagues jumped back in their leather chairs, alarmed by his sudden explosive outburst. Brad did not offer a single word of explanation to the shocked room. He blindly grabbed his suit jacket, turned on his heel, and sprinted out of the boardroom like a man actively fleeing a burning building. He practically tore the heavy glass door off its metal hinges as he lunged into the corporate hallway. His fingers were shaking so severely he could barely navigate the touchscreen of his phone. He frantically dialed Monica's personal number as he sprinted toward the executive elevators. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice lazy and distracted. Monica Brad screamed into the receiver, his lungs burning as he sprinted down the hallway. "We are being robbed. There is a massive team of men destroying the house. They are drilling through the doors and throwing everything onto the lawn. Get in your car right now. We have to go." They both raced toward the affluent suburb, tearing through the crowded Seattle streets completely and entirely convinced they were the innocent victims of a brazen daylight home invasion. Brad gripped the leather steering wheel with white knuckles, his mind frantically racing with terrifying possibilities. He swore he would completely destroy whoever was responsible for desecrating his property, entirely unaware that the real architect of his total ruin was simply watching it unfold. I stood on the expansive front porch of the Seattle mansion, breathing in the cold, damp air of the Pacific Northwest. The heavy rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a thick layer of gray mist that clung to the towering pine trees lining the affluent street. Beside me stood Gregory Pierce, his hands resting comfortably in the pockets of his dark wool overcoat. He exuded the calm, lethal confidence of a general overseeing the final decisive battle of a long campaign. Two local police officers stood at the base of the concrete stairs, their cruisers parked diagonally across the streetlights, flashing silently. The manicured front lawn was no longer a pristine symbol of suburban luxury. It was a chaotic, sprawling monument to Brad and Monica's shattered vanity. The heavy-duty junk removal team had worked with a terrifying industrial efficiency. Massive, thick black trash bags were piled high against the expensive landscaping. Monica's extensive collection of designer handbags, silk dresses, and velvet pillows had been aggressively stuffed into the bags, many of which had ripped open, spilling their overpriced contents directly into the wet mud. Brad's custom golf clubs were scattered haphazardly across the slick pavement of the driveway. The aggressive property managers representing the California investment firm stood by the shattered front door, holding clipboards and directing the laborers. They were a ruthless, highly organized unit, entirely immune to the sentimental value of the items they were currently hurling out of the house. I watched as two workers carried Brad's massive antique mahogany desk out onto the porch. They did not maneuver it carefully down the stairs. They simply shoved it over the edge, letting it crash onto the concrete walkway below, splintering the polished wood into jagged, irreparable pieces. I felt no remorse whatsoever. Suddenly, the high-pitched, agonizing screech of burning rubber shattered the quiet suburban afternoon. Brad's silver luxury sedan came tearing around the corner of the tree-lined street, completely ignoring the neighborhood speed limits. The vehicle swerved violently, its rear tires drifting across the wet asphalt before slamming over the concrete curb and skidding to a halt directly on the front lawn. The engine roared aggressively as Brad threw the car into park, tearing deep, muddy trenches into the perfectly manicured grass he had always obsessed over. The doors of the sedan flew open almost simultaneously. Brad launched himself out of the driver's seat, his face contorted into a mask of absolute unhinged fury. His expensive corporate suit was completely disheveled, his tie hanging loosely around his neck. Monica stumbled out of the passenger side, her designer athletic wear soaked with the light drizzle. She let out a piercing, hysterical shriek as her eyes swept across the devastating scene. She saw her precious velvet sofa sitting in a muddy puddle surrounded by a mountain of her ruined designer shoes. She dropped to her knees right there in the wet grass, sobbing uncontrollably. Brad did not comfort his wife. He completely ignored her, his bloodshot eyes locking onto the massive junk removal team, carrying another load of his expensive possessions out the front door. He charged forward like a wounded, desperate animal, his fists tightly clenched at his sides. He sprinted directly toward the two police officers standing at the base of the porch stairs, completely oblivious to the flashing blue and red lights reflecting off his wet face. "Arrest them," he roared, his voice cracking with pure feral panic. "Arrest every single one of them right now." He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger at the property managers. "They are robbing my house. This is a massive, coordinated home invasion. I want them in handcuffs immediately." He turned wildly, gesturing toward the shattered front door. "Look at what they are doing to my property. They broke the locks. They are destroying millions of dollars of my personal belongings. Shoot them if you have to. Just get them out of my house." The police officers did not flinch. They simply crossed their arms over their chests, maintaining a wall of absolute, unyielding professional authority. One of the officers held up a firm hand, instructing Brad to step back and calm down. "This is not a robbery, sir," the officer stated, his voice completely devoid of sympathy. "We are here to enforce a legal, authorized property eviction." Brad stared at the officer in absolute, staggering disbelief. His brain seemed entirely incapable of processing the simple sentence. An eviction. He stammered, his eyes widening in pure horror. "Are you completely out of your mind? I own this house. I pay the property taxes. You have no legal right to be here." He desperately attempted to shove his way past the officers, intent on physically attacking the workers, removing his custom home theater system. "Get out of my way," he yelled, his face turning a dangerous, volatile shade of purple. I am going in there. I am calling my lawyers. I will sue this entire police department into total bankruptcy. I will have your badges." The officers immediately unholstered their heavy batons, their posture shifting into a defensive, aggressive stance. They loudly ordered him to step back immediately, warning him that any further aggression would result in immediate arrest. Brad froze his chest, heaving with extreme exhaustion and blinding rage. He took a slow, trembling step backward, finally raising his eyes toward the elevated front porch. For the very first time since his frantic arrival, his gaze landed directly on me. I was not shuffling. I was not hunched over. I was not looking at the floor in timid submission. I stood perfectly straight, my shoulders squared, radiating an aura of absolute, unbreakable authority. I looked down at my son, making sure he saw the cold, calculated intelligence shining brightly in my steady eyes. The sheer absolute shock that washed over Brad's face was incredibly satisfying. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked at Gregory Pierce standing silently by my side, recognizing the legendary corporate attorney immediately. His arrogant, entitled mind desperately struggled to connect the impossible dots. He looked back at me, his expression transitioning from furious anger into a dark, terrifying realization. He finally understood that he was not the predator in this scenario. He finally realized that the frail, confused old man he had been ruthlessly abusing never actually existed. "Dad, what the hell did you do?" Brad yelled, his voice echoing violently across the ruined lawn. "Tell them to get out of my house right now. Tell them to stop." Gregory Pierce stepped forward, moving to the top of the concrete stairs with a slow, deliberate grace. A cold, truly merciless smile touched the very corners of his sharp mouth. He reached inside his tailored coat and retrieved a single, neatly folded piece of thick legal paper. He extended his arm downward, offering the damning document to my son. He held the stark white eviction notice directly in front of Brad's trembling hands. The crisp document effectively ended their reign of terror and marked the beginning of my ultimate retribution. "You do not own this house," Brad Gregory stated, his voice completely steady and terrifyingly calm. Gregory extended his hand, pressing the heavy document flat against my son's chest, until Brad reflexively raised his hands to take it. The rain had reduced to a fine mist hanging over the chaotic front lawn. Brad stared down at the crisp white paper, his bloodshot eyes darting back and forth across the dense legal text. I watched his breathing stall. I watched the arrogant, entitled posture drain out of his spine. The document was a formalized notice of immediate eviction legally executed by the California corporate investment firm that now held absolute title to the property. Attached to the back of the eviction order was a certified copy of the irrevocable living trust. Brad flipped the page, his hands beginning to shake violently as his eyes scanned the highlighted sections. "You are a conditional temporary tenant," Gregory explained, his voice projecting clearly over the low rumble of the idling police cruisers. "You have never held a single shred of equity in this estate. The property was purchased entirely through a specialized trust designed specifically to protect vulnerable assets from financial predators. My client is the sole uncontested trustee. You merely occupied the guest quarters at his personal discretion. That discretion has now been permanently revoked. The property was sold early this morning to a private commercial holding group. The wire transfer has cleared. The deed has been officially reassigned. You are currently trespassing on private corporate-owned land." Brad's mouth opened and closed silently. He looked from the legal documents in his trembling hands to the massive junk removal team, carrying his custom leather armchairs out the front door. He shook his head in frantic, desperate denial. "This is impossible," he stammered, his voice thin and hollow. "I negotiated the purchase. I pay the monthly homeowners association dues. I maintain the utility accounts. I just submitted the paperwork for a $500,000 home equity line of credit against this property." Gregory offered a sharp, humorless chuckle. "Paying the electric bill does not grant you a property deed, Brad," he stated. And as for your fraudulent attempt to leverage an asset you do not own, that constitutes severe federal wire fraud. The bank underwriting your loan application will be highly interested to discover you forged my client's signature on their digital submission portal. The sheer magnitude of the catastrophic reality finally crashed down upon them. Monica, who had been kneeling in the wet grass surrounded by her ruined designer shoes, let out a piercing, guttural shriek. She scrambled to her feet, her expensive athletic jacket stained with dark mud. She sprinted toward the porch stairs, her face contorted in absolute panic. "What is he talking about?" she screamed, grabbing Brad's arm and violently shaking him. "Tell me he is lying. Tell me we still have the house. We need that bank loan to clear tomorrow. My vendors are demanding payment. If we do not get that cash, my cosmetics company is going to be forced into immediate bankruptcy. We will lose absolutely everything." Brad could not answer her. He could only stare at the certified trust documents, his entire fraudulent empire crumbling into dust right before his eyes. He had spent months meticulously planning my chemical lobotomy, fully believing he was a brilliant mastermind executing a flawless financial takeover. Now he was standing in the mud, holding the undeniable proof of his own monumental stupidity. He had zero equity. He had zero leverage. He possessed absolutely nothing but a mountain of crushing debt and an impending federal criminal investigation. Monica realized the terrifying truth through his stunned silence. She completely lost her mind. She turned on him with the vicious ferocity of a trapped animal. "You told me this was handled," she shrieked, slamming her fists against his chest. "You promised me we were financially secure. You said the old man was a helpless idiot. You said we controlled the entire estate. You ruined my life. You ruined my business. We are completely homeless." She buried her face in her muddy hands, sobbing hysterically, as the junk removal crew carelessly tossed a box of her expensive crystal decanters onto the driveway. The glass shattered loudly against the wet concrete, perfectly mirroring the destruction of her luxurious, stolen lifestyle. But Brad was entirely incapable of accepting defeat. His massive ego simply would not allow him to surrender to the overwhelming reality of his failure. He shoved Monica aside and turned his frantic, desperate attention toward the two police officers standing at the base of the concrete stairs. He desperately attempted to play his final pathetic card. He smoothed his ruined tie and plastered a look of profound, manufactured concern across his pale face. "Officers, you have to stop this immediately," Brad pleaded, his voice dripping with false desperation. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me and then shifted his aim toward Gregory Pierce. "My father is not well. He is suffering from rapid severe cognitive decline. He has dementia. He has been entirely confused and disoriented for weeks. He does not even know what day it is. This man is a predatory corporate lawyer who has somehow manipulated my sick, vulnerable father into signing away his entire life savings. This is a massive case of elder financial abuse. You need to arrest this lawyer right now and stop these workers from destroying our family home." The officers did not move a single muscle. They had already reviewed the certified legal documents provided by the California investment firm, and they had already received direct authorization from their precinct commander to facilitate the corporate eviction. They looked at Brad with a mixture of professional boredom and thinly veiled disgust. Brad took a step forward, his voice growing incredibly shrill. "Listen to me!" he yelled, his panic reaching a fever pitch. "My father needs urgent medical intervention. He is entirely incapable of making independent legal decisions. I am his primary caregiver. I am his only son. He requires immediate psychiatric evaluation. Look at him. He is old, frail, and completely delusional. If you let this lawyer steal his house, you are complicit in a massive criminal conspiracy. I demand that you place my father in protective custody right now." I decided it was finally time to deliver the absolute concluding blow. I slowly descended the concrete stairs of the expansive front porch, moving with deliberate, unwavering confidence. I did not shuffle my feet. I did not hunch my shoulders. I stood incredibly tall, radiating the quiet, immense power of a man who had successfully navigated the deepest, darkest depths of familial betrayal and emerged entirely victorious. I walked directly past the police officers, stopping just 2 feet away from my trembling, sweating son. Brad looked at me, his eyes searching my face for any trace of the frail victim he thought he conquered. He found nothing but cold resolve. I looked him in the eye. "I'm not senile, Brad," I said. "I'm just a clueless old man who learned how to use a hidden camera." The silence that followed my statement was absolute. The steady hum of the idling police cruisers and the distant sound of the junk removal team dragging heavy furniture across the wet driveway seemed to fade into a hollow vacuum. Brad stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, his mouth slightly open, as the crushing weight of my words finally penetrated his impenetrable arrogance. He physically stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the wet grass. He shook his head frantically, a pathetic gesture of denial. A hidden camera. He muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "You are lying. You do not even know how to operate a modern cellular phone. You are completely bluffing." Gregory Pierce did not offer a verbal response. He simply reached into the interior pocket of his tailored overcoat and retrieved a sleek silver tablet. He unlocked the device with a swift motion of his thumb and turned the bright high-definition screen toward the 2 police officers standing at the base of the porch stairs. "Officers," Gregory announced, his voice projecting with crisp, authoritative clarity. "My client has been subjected to severe prolonged domestic abuse and targeted financial exploitation. We have compiled a comprehensive digital dossier of these criminal activities. I believe you will find the contents highly relevant to your current jurisdiction." The 2 officers exchanged a quick professional glance before stepping forward, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. Gregory tapped the glass screen, initiating the first video file. The crystal-clear footage displayed the interior of my private study captured late at night just 3 weeks prior. The angle was positioned perfectly from the top of the bookshelf. On the screen, Brad was sitting at my antique mahogany desk, holding a stack of federal banking documents under a single desk lamp. The audio picked up his muttered curses as he practiced signing my legal name onto a scrap piece of paper. He then carefully forged my signature onto the primary application line of the $500,000 home equity loan. Brad let out a strangled, pathetic gasp, watching his own image commit a severe federal felony right in front of armed law enforcement. "That is manipulated footage," he shouted, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "It is a deep fake. It is artificial intelligence. I never signed those documents." The lead officer did not acknowledge his frantic protests. He simply leaned closer to the tablet, his expression hardening into a mask of cold, professional scrutiny. "Wire fraud and identity theft," Gregory stated calmly, swiping to the next digital file. "Both federal offenses carrying mandatory minimum sentences in a federal penitentiary." Gregory tapped the screen again. This time the footage transitioned to the bright marble-covered kitchen. The timestamp indicated it was from exactly 4 days ago. Monica and Brad were standing by the large center island. Monica was holding the small amber plastic bottle containing my vital heart medication. The audio captured her voice with terrifying precision. "If we simply grind these up and dissolve them into his evening tea," Monica stated on the recording, her tone casually callous, "his blood pressure will drop significantly during the night. It will look entirely natural. A tragic but expected failure of his aging heart." Brad nodded in agreement on the screen, adding that it would finally secure their absolute control over the estate without any lingering legal complications. Monica let out a high-pitched, hysterical shriek, realizing the sheer devastating magnitude of the audio recording. She had not merely been caught being cruel. She had been caught actively premeditating a lethal poisoning. Her survival instinct immediately overrode her shock. She spun around, her muddy designer athletic wear clinging to her trembling body, and bolted toward the open street. She did not even glance back at her husband. She sprinted with absolute blind panic, desperately attempting to escape the impending consequences of her own horrific greed. The second police officer moved with incredible trained efficiency. He lunged across the wet lawn, intercepting her before she could reach the sidewalk. He grabbed her arm firmly, spinning her around and forcing her hands behind her back. Monica thrashed wildly, screaming that she had absolutely nothing to do with it, but the officer easily subdued her, pressing her against the cold, wet hood of the police cruiser. Brad watched his wife being detained, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. He looked back at the officers, his hands raised in a final pathetic gesture of surrender. "Please," he begged, tears streaming down his pale, sweating face. "You have to understand the pressure I was under. The financial stress was completely unbearable. I was not actually going to hurt him. It was just talk. We were just venting our frustrations." Gregory completely ignored the desperate pleas. He simply initiated the third and final video file. The tablet screen illuminated with the sharp, violent confrontation that had occurred in the kitchen just hours earlier that very morning. The footage clearly displayed me sitting quietly at the marble island, perfectly embodying the frail, submissive victim. It showed Brad storming into the room, demanding my pension money. And then it showed the brutal, undeniable reality of the physical assault. The two police officers watched in stony silence as the digital version of Brad grabbed me by the collar, yanked me from the stool, and delivered the first vicious slap. The sharp crack of flesh striking flesh echoed loudly from the tablet speakers, cutting through the damp suburban air. They watched him strike me a second time, then a third. They watched him deliver 13 consecutive brutal blows to a defenseless elderly man. The lead officer immediately unhooked the heavy metal handcuffs from his utility belt. The metallic clinking sound was incredibly loud in the sudden heavy silence that followed the end of the video. The officer stepped purposefully onto the wet grass, marching directly toward Brad. Brad did not attempt to run. His legs completely gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto his knees in the middle of his ruined front lawn, landing hard in the muddy trench his own luxury vehicle had carved just minutes earlier. He raised his trembling hands, staring up at me with an expression of absolute shattered defeat. "Dad, please," he sobbed, his chest heaving with heavy, agonizing breaths. "I am your son. I am your only son. You cannot let them do this to me. I will lose my job. I will lose everything. Please, Dad, have some mercy. I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry." The officer grabbed Brad's arms forcefully, yanking them behind his back. Brad screamed in pain as the cold steel cuffs locked tightly around his wrists, the ratcheting sound signaling the absolute permanent end of his arrogant reign. The officer recited the Miranda rights, his voice a steady, rhythmic drone of legal consequence, listing the charges of felony elder abuse, aggravated assault, and severe financial fraud. I stood on the elevated porch, looking down at the pathetic, weeping man kneeling in the mud. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no lingering parental guilt. The son I had loved and protected had died a long time ago, replaced entirely by a greedy, ruthless parasite. I did not offer a final dramatic speech. I did not gloat or scream or demand an apology. I simply turned my back on him. I walked slowly and deliberately down the opposite side of the expansive concrete stairs. Gregory Pierce followed closely behind me, slipping the silver tablet back into his tailored overcoat. We walked together down the long paved driveway, completely bypassing the massive pile of ruined designer clothing and shattered furniture. The sleek black town car was waiting for us at the curb, the engine purring softly in the cool afternoon air. The driver immediately stepped out, opening the rear door with a respectful nod. I climbed into the warm, luxurious interior of the vehicle, settling into the soft leather seat. Gregory slid in beside me, pulling the door shut with a solid, satisfying thud that completely blocked out the sound of Brad's pathetic, echoing screams. The driver smoothly shifted the car into gear, pulling away from the curb and leaving the Seattle suburb behind. I did not look back out the window. I did not need to see the ruins of their manufactured empire. The cold, heavy rain began to fall again, washing away the bitter memories of the past, leaving me with nothing but the quiet, magnificent peace of absolute victory. I watched the flashing blue and red lights slowly fade into the heavy gray mist through the rearview mirror. I shed no tears for the son I had lost. I carried no heavy regrets regarding the severe actions I had taken. Instead, a profound, stabilizing peace settled deep into my bones. It was the quiet, absolute satisfaction of a surgical strike perfectly executed. The toxic infection had been cleanly severed from my life. The meticulously designed architectural trap had operated with flawless mechanical precision, completely crushing his arrogant assumptions. A few short weeks later, the damp chill of the Pacific Northwest was nothing but a distant memory. I was sitting comfortably on the sun-drenched balcony of a beautiful, sprawling oceanfront condo in southern Florida. The vibrant turquoise waves rolled gently against the pristine white sand. My secure mobile phone chimed on the glass patio table. It was an incoming call from Gregory Pierce. I answered the line, listening to the steady hum of his professional voice. The legal updates were incredibly swift and devastatingly final. Brad had been officially denied bail by the presiding federal judge. The overwhelming mountain of digital evidence made him an extreme flight risk. He was currently sitting in a concrete holding cell awaiting a lengthy criminal trial for severe wire fraud and felony elder abuse. He was completely stripped of his expensive suits and his arrogant corporate pride. Monica was faring no better. Gregory calmly confirmed that aggressive federal investigators had completely seized all of her fraudulent corporate accounts. Her highly publicized cosmetics company was entirely dismantled, exposed as an elaborate financial illusion built upon stolen funds. She was facing her own severe criminal indictment regarding the documented conspiracy to commit lethal medical tampering. Their carefully manufactured empire of boundless greed was nothing but ashes. The walls of their fabricated reality had entirely collapsed, leaving them both completely exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of the American judicial system. I ended the call and placed the phone face down. The millions of dollars generated from the rapid corporate sale of the Seattle estate were completely secure. But I did not intend to simply hoard that massive wealth. I had instructed Gregory to use a significantly large portion of those exact funds to immediately establish a dedicated, highly aggressive legal defense foundation. The primary mission of this new charitable trust was singular and unyielding. We were going to provide elite legal protection for vulnerable elderly citizens who were actively facing severe financial exploitation from predatory family members. I would ensure that no other aging parent would ever be violently trapped, abused, or silenced in the dark shadows of their own home. I would fund private investigators, hidden cameras, and ruthless corporate attorneys to completely level the playing field for those who could not physically defend themselves. It was a fitting, powerful redirection of my newly acquired resources. I leaned back in my comfortable patio chair, letting the warm tropical breeze wash over my face. The heavy, suffocating darkness of that ground floor suite was finally permanently banished from my daily existence. I picked up my ceramic mug, holding it with perfectly steady, incredibly strong hands. I took a long, deeply satisfying sip of the hot, rich black coffee. It was pure, strong, and completely unpoisoned. The bitter taste of constant fear and forced submission was entirely gone, replaced by the sweet nectar of personal redemption. I closed my eyes and breathed in the clean, salty ocean air, listening to the soothing rhythm of the crashing tide. For the first time in what felt like an absolute eternity, I was completely, unconditionally, and permanently free. I had engineered my own salvation, utilizing their towering arrogance as the primary instrument of their catastrophic downfall. The grand illusion was finally over, leaving nothing behind but the undeniable foundation of ultimate unyielding truth. The war was now officially finished. The hardest truth I learned is that blood does not guarantee loyalty, and love should never mean allowing yourself to be a victim. As parents, we spend our lives building a foundation to protect our children. But sometimes the very people we carefully sheltered are the exact ones we must protect ourselves from. Greed can completely rot a soul, blinding them to the sacrifices that gave them everything. True strength is not enduring abuse in silence. It is having the courage to stand up, reclaim your dignity, and show them that kindness is not a weakness to be endlessly exploited. Have you ever faced betrayal from someone you loved and trusted with your entire life? How did you find the strength to fight back? Share your personal story in the comments below. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful life lessons.